The dust settles over the Arcadian hills. The afternoon sun cuts through the haze of battle like bronze through flesh. The air reeks of copper, sweat, and the acrid stench of voided bowels, the signature perfume of slaughter. Across a valley choked with corpses, the blood-soaked Spartan phalanx stands in formation, shields locked, spears vertical, breathing in unison. Silence. Then, the sound that every Spartan commander dreads. The roll call. One by one, the commanders move through the ranks, counting their men. They pass shields dented from impact, spears slick with enemy blood, breastplates cracked from direct hits. They check faces, sweat-streaked, dust-caked, wild-eyed from the chaos of close combat. The Lokagoi call out names. Every name receives an answer. Every single one. Not a single Spartan has fallen, or so the ancient sources claim. Around them, scattered across the killing ground like wheat after harvest, lie the broken bodies of thousands of enemies, Arcadians, Argives, Messenians, an entire coalition army, shattered, butchered, annihilated. Some died from spear thrusts to the throat. Others were trampled in the rout, their rib cages crushed under the weight of their own fleeing comrades. The crows are already circling, but the Spartans? Not one dead, not one. This shouldn't be possible. In ancient warfare, even victory demands sacrifice. The front rank always pays the blood price. But today, 368 BC, in the shadow of Mount Parasia, the impossible became history. This is the story of the Tearless Battle. The day Sparta reminded the world that wounded lions are the most dangerous of all. If you want to witness the most brutal and unbelievable victories in ancient warfare, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're diving deep into the blood-soaked battles that history forgot to glorify. Now, let's see how a broken empire pulled off the impossible. 3 years earlier, the unthinkable happened. On the plains of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Spartan war machine, undefeated for generations, the terror of Greece for 2 centuries, was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The Theban general Epaminondas smashed the Spartan phalanx with tactical brilliance that rewrote the rules of Greek warfare. 400 Spartan citizens died that day. In a nation where the full citizen body numbered barely more than 1,000 warriors, this was a death sentence. King Cleombrotus fell with his royal guard around him, butchered in the chaos of the Theban assault. The rest of the Peloponnesian allies, men who'd followed Sparta out of fear, not love, saw their moment and fled. Sparta's hegemony over Greece, built over centuries of blood and iron, collapsed in a single afternoon. The world thought Sparta was finished. They were wrong. Enter Archidamus III, son of King Agesilaus II, heir to the Eurypontid throne, and the man who had refused to let Sparta die quietly, where his father had been a brilliant but aging king. Archidamus was a warrior in his prime, hard, calculating, and fueled by the kind of rage that only comes from watching your civilization crumble. He'd been present after Leuctra, leading the relief force that arrived too late to save the army, but in time to see the aftermath. The wailing families, the empty barracks, the haunted eyes of survivors. Sparta had lost more than a battle. It had lost its mystique. Its helot slaves in Messenia, an entire population held down for generations through terror, saw their oppressors bleed and sensed opportunity. Messenia revolted. The Thebans marched into the Peloponnese 4 times between 370 and 368 BC, invading Spartan territory with impunity. They even freed the Messenian helots, creating an independent Messenian state for the first time in centuries. Sparta's allies abandoned them. The Arcadians, hill tribes from the centre of the Peloponnese, formed a coalition with Argos and the new Messenian state. They weren't just rebelling. They were preparing to finish what Thebes had started, the complete annihilation of Sparta as a military power. By 368 BC, Sparta was surrounded by enemies drunk on the prospect of vengeance. The Arcadians, once reluctant Spartan allies, now raised armies and built a new capital at Megalopolis, great city, a deliberate middle finger to Spartan dominance. The Argives, bitter from centuries of rivalry, joined them. The Messenians, freed from slavery, thirsted for Spartan blood with a hunger that can only come from generational trauma. They all remembered how Sparta had treated them, how Spartan warriors had marched through their lands, enslaved their people, burned their farms. Now, with Sparta weakened, bleeding and isolated, the coalition saw a chance not just for independence, but for revenge. They began raiding Laconia itself, Sparta's heartland, burning farms, killing helots, testing the defences, probing for weakness. They wanted to draw the Spartans out, bleed them slowly, death by 1,000 cuts. Archidamus understood the strategy. He also understood that Sparta had no choice. They couldn't hide behind their walls forever. The agricultural base was collapsing. Morale was collapsing. If Sparta didn't act decisively, the city-state that had ruled Greece for 2 centuries would become a footnote in history. But Archidamus had a problem. Numbers. Sparta simply didn't have enough warriors left. The citizen body was too small, the losses at Leuctra too catastrophic. To field an army capable of challenging the Arcadian coalition, he needed help. And he found it in the most unexpected place, Sicily. Dionysius I of Syracuse, tyrant, warlord, and one of the most powerful rulers in the Greek world, owed Sparta favours from past alliances. When Archidamus sent word of Sparta's dire situation, Dionysius responded with mercenaries, but not just any mercenaries. He sent Celts. These weren't Greeks. These were tribal warriors from the north, tall, wild-haired, covered in war paint and speaking a guttural tongue that sounded like rocks grinding together. They carried long, slashing swords instead of short Greek xiphos. They fought with a berserker fury that unnerved even the Spartans. They were expensive, undisciplined, and utterly savage in battle. They were exactly what Archidamus needed. Spring 368 BC. Archidamus assembles his army outside Sparta's walls. The Spartan contingent is small, perhaps a few hundred full citizens, bolstered by perioikoi and what helots could still be trusted. The men stand in their red cloaks, shields polished, spears gleaming. They look disciplined, professional, deadly, and haunted. Every man in that formation has lost brothers, fathers, friends at Leuctra. They've spent 3 years watching their homeland invaded, their farms burned, their reputation destroyed. They've been called cowards. They've been mocked as the once great Spartans by their enemies. The psychological weight is almost unbearable. But now they have a chance to respond. The morning air is cold, sharp against exposed skin. The men check their equipment with practiced efficiency. Leather straps are tightened. Bronze is polished one final time. Each warrior knows his position, knows the man beside him, knows that survival depends on absolute unity. This isn't just another campaign. This is redemption or oblivion. Archidamus walks among them, speaking in the clipped, efficient manner of Spartan leadership. No flowery speeches, no appeals to glory. Just simple truth. They march to war, and they will either restore Sparta's honour or die trying. The men appreciate the honesty. False hope would be an insult. Then the mercenaries arrive. The Celts march into camp like a force of nature made flesh. They're massive. Most stand a head taller than the average Greek. Their hair is lime-washed into spikes. Their bare chests are covered in blue woad tattoos depicting spirals, animals, and symbols the Greeks can't decipher. They carry oval shields painted with tribal markings and wield swords as long as a man's leg. They smell like beer, wood smoke, and blood. The Spartans eye them with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. These barbarians don't fight in formation. They don't understand discipline. But when they charge like wolves. Fast, vicious, overwhelming. And they have no stake in Greek politics, no complex loyalties. They're here for gold and glory, and they don't care who bleeds to provide it. The cultural clash is immediate and profound. The Celts laugh too loud, drink too much, and seem utterly unconcerned with the gravity of the situation. To them, this is just another job, another chance to test their courage and earn wealth. The Spartans, raised in a culture of iron discipline and stoic endurance, find them both fascinating and repulsive. But Archidamus sees their value. The Celts bring raw aggression that complements Spartan discipline. Where the phalanx is an immovable wall, the Celts are a storm of blades. Together, they represent something the coalition won't expect. Controlled chaos married to tactical brilliance. Archidamus addresses both groups through translators. His message simple: we march into Arcadia, we will take their cities, and we will remind them why Sparta ruled Greece for 200 years. The army moves north into Arcadia under the cover of early morning. The terrain is brutal. Narrow passes through pine forests, rocky hills that shred sandals, streams swollen with spring melt. The Spartans march in silence, each man locked in his own thoughts. The Celts sing war songs in their incomprehensible language, the melodies haunting and alien in the Greek wilderness. The mountain paths are treacherous. Loose stones turn beneath feet. Dust clouds rise with each step, coating throats and lungs. The weight of shield and spear becomes oppressive in the climbing heat of day. But the Spartans endure. They've been trained since childhood to embrace suffering, to find strength in discomfort. The Celts seem unbothered, moving through rough terrain with the easy confidence of men raised in similarly harsh lands. Archidamus's strategy is aggressive. Strike fast, strike hard, and force the enemy to react. He knows the Arcadians have superior numbers. He knows they can call on reinforcements from Argos and Messenia. His only advantage is speed and surprise. If he can catch them off balance, force them to fight on his terms, he might just survive this campaign. The scouts report back throughout the march, bringing intelligence on enemy movements, terrain features, water sources. Archidamus processes each report with cold efficiency, adjusting his route, his timing, his approach. He's not just marching into enemy territory, he's setting a trap that won't spring for days. First target, Carii. The small fortress town sits on the border between Laconia and Arcadia, a strategic choke point that controls access to the northern routes. Archidamus needs it as a staging base. More importantly, he needs a victory, any victory, to prove Sparta can still bite. The assault is swift and brutal. The Spartans scale the walls at dawn while the Celts smash through the gates with axes. The garrison barely has time to arm themselves before the city is overrun. The fighting is close, desperate, and over quickly. Archidamus leaves a small holding force and keeps moving. He's not here to occupy, he's here to terrorize. Next comes the territory of the Perrasi, an Arcadian tribe that had been particularly enthusiastic about raiding Spartan lands. Archidamus doesn't just march through Perrhasia, he destroys it. The Celts are unleashed like hounds. They burn farms, slaughter livestock, and drive the population into the hills. The Spartans, normally disciplined and controlled, participate with a cold fury that shocks even their mercenary allies. This isn't warfare. This is a message written in ashen blood. Sparta is not dead. Smoke rises from a dozen villages across the Arcadian highlands. The destruction is systematic, calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. Fields are salted, wells are poisoned. Anything of value is either taken or destroyed. Refugees flood toward the coalition army, screaming for protection, their terror spreading like wildfire through the Arcadian population. And finally, the Arcadian leadership has no choice. They mobilize everything they have. Word reaches Archidamus from his scouts. A massive coalition force is approaching from the north. Arcadians, Argives, Messenians. Perhaps many thousands of men, a force large enough to overwhelm the Spartan army through sheer weight of numbers. They're angry, undisciplined, and eager to crush the Spartans once and for all. The coalition commanders see this as their moment. Sparta's last army is in their territory, isolated, outnumbered. If they can destroy it here, Sparta dies. Archidamus studies the terrain with the eyes of a predator. He knows the coalition will try to pin him against the mountains, cut off his retreat, and grind his smaller force into oblivion through attrition. The logical move would be to withdraw, fall back to defensible ground, avoid battle, preserve his army. Every military principle suggests retreat is the smart play. But Archidamus doesn't retreat. Instead, he withdraws into the hills near a place called Balea in the shadow of Mount Parasia. It looks like a retreat. It looks like fear. The coalition commanders smell blood in the water. They see a wounded, desperate enemy trying to escape. They increase their pace, eager to catch the Spartans before they can reach safety. They are about to learn that wounded lions don't retreat. They ambush. Archidamus has chosen his ground carefully. The hills offer concealment, elevation, and multiple escape routes. But more importantly, they channel the enemy into predictable approaches. The coalition army, in their eagerness to crush the Spartans, is walking directly into a killing ground. Here's where it gets interesting. The Celtic mercenaries, loud, undisciplined, and eager to leave this Greek civil war and collect their pay, decide they want to go home. They pack up, form column, and start marching south toward the coast where Dionysius' ships are waiting. To the coalition scouts watching from the hills, it looks like the Spartan alliance is fracturing. The mercenaries are abandoning Archidamus. The Spartan force is now even smaller, more vulnerable. The Messenians, positioned to the south, see the Celts approaching and prepare to intercept them. It's the perfect moment to strike. The coalition army moves to surround the remaining Spartan force. The Messenians advance to cut off the Celts. The Arcadians and Argives prepare for a frontal assault. They have Archidamus right where they want him, trapped, outnumbered, and about to be destroyed. What they don't realise is that they've just walked into the kill zone. The Celtic withdrawal wasn't desertion, it was bait. Archidamus has split the coalition's attention, divided their forces, and drawn them into rough terrain where numerical superiority means nothing. The Messenians are isolated from the main army. The Arcadians and Argives are advancing uphill toward a prepared defensive position. The trap is set. All that remains is to spring it, and nature itself is about to provide the signal. Thunder rolls across the sky from the right side. The direction that every Greek warrior knows means divine approval, the voice of Zeus himself blessing their cause. Archidamus raises his spear. The Spartans lock shields. The paean rises from 100 throats. The hills near Balea are unforgiving terrain. Rocky outcroppings jut from earth like broken teeth. Pine forests cling to slopes too steep for agriculture. Narrow valleys wind between ridges, creating natural corridors that funnel movement into predictable paths. For a conventional army seeking open ground to deploy their superior numbers, this landscape is a nightmare. For Archidamus, it's perfect. He positions his forces on elevated ground with their backs to Mount Parasia. Below, the approaches are limited. 3 main routes, each constricted by terrain, each offering clear lines of sight for defenders. The Spartans can see anyone approaching long before they arrive. More importantly, any force advancing uphill will be exhausted, disorganized, and vulnerable by the time they reach Spartan spears. Archidamus walks the position personally, examining every angle, every approach. He notes where the sun will be during different hours, how shadows will fall, where dust will obscure vision. He identifies killing zones, places where the enemy will be most exposed, most vulnerable. He positions his best troops at critical junctures and his weakest where terrain itself provides advantage. The Spartan commanders understand immediately, this isn't a retreat, this is a killing ground. The coalition army, in their eagerness to crush the Spartans, will have to come to them. They'll have to advance uphill, through constricted terrain, against a prepared defensive position held by the most disciplined heavy infantry in the Greek world. It's a tactical nightmare for the attackers. Meanwhile, the coalition commanders are celebrating. From their perspective, everything is going according to plan. The Spartans are trapped against the mountains. Their Celtic mercenaries have abandoned them. The remaining Spartan force is isolated, outnumbered at least 3-1, possibly more. All that remains is the final assault. The Arcadian general, his name lost to history but his arrogance preserved by it, convenes his war council. Around him sit Argive commanders eager for revenge, Messenian leaders hungry for Spartan blood, and various tribal chiefs from across Arcadia who see this as their moment. They've spent 3 years watching Sparta bleed. Now they'll deliver the killing blow. The mood is almost festive. Wine is passed. Toasts are made to the imminent destruction of Sparta's last field army. Some commanders argue for caution. The Spartans are cornered, desperate and dangerous. But they're shouted down by the majority who see only numbers. Thousands of coalition troops against perhaps 1,500 Spartans and their remaining allies. The math seems simple. What they don't discuss is the quality of those troops. The coalition army is massive but disparate. Arcadian farmers called from their fields, Argive citizens with minimal training, Messenian ex-slaves who've only recently learned to hold a spear. They have courage, certainly, and motivation, but they don't have the decades of training, the ingrained discipline, the muscle memory that turns Spartan warriors into killing machines. The coalition commanders make their fatal mistake. They assume this will be a conventional battle. They plan to advance on multiple fronts, surround the Spartan position, and crush them through sheer weight of numbers. They don't consider that Archidamus might be hoping for exactly that. They don't recognize the trap because they're too focused on the bait. Night falls over the Spartan camp. The men sit in small groups, checking equipment with ritualistic precision. A Spartan warrior's relationship with his gear is almost religious. The shield, the aspis, is not just protection, it's the literal and symbolic defense of the man beside you. To lose your shield is to abandon your brothers, the ultimate shame. Each shield weighs about 16 to 18 pounds, constructed of wood and bronze, concave to deflect blows. The inside grip is simple but effective. One arm through a leather band at the rim, hand gripping a rope at the centre. Properly held, the shield protects you from chin to knee and overlaps with your neighbour's shield, creating a wall of bronze. The spear, the dory, is equally personal. 8 to 10 feet of ashwood tipped with iron, balanced for both thrusting and throwing if necessary. Most Spartans never throw their spears. The dory is a thrusting weapon, designed for the brutal shoving match that is phalanx warfare. A bronze spike on the butt end serves as both counterweight and backup weapon if the primary point breaks. The men sharpen their secondary weapons. The xiphos, a short sword designed for close-quarters butchery when the phalanx compresses into othismos. The infamous pushing, where formations collapse into grinding claustrophobic murder. It's in the othismos that battles are decided, when the front ranks are so compressed that men can barely move their arms. When you kill by short, upward thrusts into groins and armpits and throats. Tonight, the Spartans sharpen their blades and think about home, about the wives and children they're fighting to protect, about the farms and olive groves being burned by coalition raiders, about the humiliation of Leuctra and the 3 years of shame that followed. Each man carries his own motivation, his own burning coal of rage that will become an inferno when battle is joined. The younger warriors, those who've never experienced a major battle, are nervous. You can see it in how they fidget with their equipment, how they seek reassurance from veterans. The older men, those who remember when Sparta ruled Greece through fear alone, are quiet. They've been waiting 3 years for this moment. They're not nervous. They're hungry. Archidamus moves among his men as darkness deepens. He doesn't give speeches. That's not the Spartan way. Instead, he stops at fire circles, asks about equipment, inquires after specific warriors he knows have suffered losses. His presence is enough. This is the man who will lead them back to glory or die trying. One young warrior, barely 20, asks the question they're all thinking. "Sir, what if we fail?" Archidamus looks at him for a long moment. The firelight flickers across his scarred face. "Then we die," he says simply. "But Sparta has been dying for 3 years. Tomorrow we either resurrect or join the corpse. I prefer resurrection." The men appreciate the honesty. They've had enough of false hope and political manoeuvring. They're warriors facing an existential battle, and they want truth. Archidamus gives them that. He also gives them something more valuable: confidence. Not blind optimism, but the cold certainty that their commander has stacked the deck as much as possible. That if they maintain discipline, trust their training, and remember their heritage, they can win. Around the camp, the Peroikoi, free non-citizens who fight beside the Spartans, prepare in their own way. They're not quite Spartan, not quite equal, but they've earned respect through shared blood over the years. They know they'll be in the battle line tomorrow, shields locked with full citizens, and that Archidamus will demand the same courage from them. The Peroikoi have something to prove, and they'll prove it in blood. The few trusted helots in the army occupy a strange position. They're slaves, technically, but armed slaves fighting for their master's survival. Some resent the Spartans and are only here because they have no choice. Others have been promised freedom if Sparta survives and have embraced the cause. All of them understand that if the coalition wins, their fate won't be any better. The Messenians won't see them as brothers, but as collaborators. They're committed now, whether they want to be or not. Dawn arrives with unusual weather. Dark clouds gather to the east, backlit by the rising sun, creating a spectacle of crimson and gold that seems almost apocalyptic. The Spartans take this as a sign: red sky at morning, warrior take warning, but also a promise of blood to be spilled. Greek warfare is deeply intertwined with religion, and signs matter. The seers, mantes who accompany every Greek army, perform the pre-battle sacrifices. A goat is slaughtered, its entrails examined for signs from the gods. The liver is healthy, the colour good. The intestines show no defects. The seers confer and announce, the gods favour Sparta today. The men don't cheer, Spartans don't cheer, but you can feel the collective exhale of relief. Divine favour isn't everything, but it helps. Then comes the thunder. It rolls across the hills from the right, the east, the direction sacred to Zeus. In Greek augury, thunder from the right is the most powerful omen possible. It means the king of the gods himself approves your cause. It means victory is not just possible but ordained. The Spartans begin their pre-battle rituals with renewed confidence. They oil their bodies and comb their long hair, the famous Spartan tradition of beautifying themselves before battle. To outsiders, this seems vain, even effeminate. But there's deep psychology at work. Preparing yourself as if for a festival, making yourself beautiful, sends a message. We're not afraid to die. We embrace death so completely that we dress for it as for a wedding. The red cloaks come out. Not every man has one. Equipment is personal property, and some can't afford the luxury of dyed wool. But enough wear red that the formation will be visible from a distance, a crimson slash across the hillside. The colour choice is practical as well as symbolic. Red doesn't show blood. In the chaos of battle, you don't want your comrades seeing you wounded and losing morale. Better to bleed invisibly. In the valley below, the coalition army is stirring. From the Spartan position, they look like a disturbed anthill. Thousands of men forming into rough units, commanders shouting orders, standards being raised. The coalition has numbers but lacks the cohesion of a professional army. Different contingents wear different armour, carry different shields, respond to different commanders. The Arcadians form the core, the largest contingent fighting on their home territory. They're motivated defenders, but many are part-time soldiers. They've trained with their local militias but haven't experienced the grinding horror of a major battle. They know the theory of phalanx warfare but not the reality. The Argives are more experienced. Argos has been fighting Sparta on and off for centuries. Their warriors understand what they're facing. but understanding and being prepared are different things. The Argives remember their defeats as much as their victories. Somewhere in their collective memory is the knowledge that Sparta, even wounded, is still the most dangerous military power in Greece. The Messenians are the wild card. They're relatively new to freedom, newly trained, burning with generational hatred for Sparta. They want Spartan blood more than anyone else in the coalition. But that very hatred makes them dangerous to their own side. Hatred clouds judgment. It makes you reckless. And recklessness in hoplite warfare is suicide. The coalition commanders issue their orders. The plan is straightforward. Advance on multiple axes. Use their superior numbers to envelop the Spartan position and crush them through sheer mass. 3 columns will attack simultaneously. Messenians from the south to cut off retreat, Arcadians from the west in a frontal assault, Argives from the north to collapse the flank. It's a sound plan on papyrus. In the actual terrain, it's going to be a disaster. The 3 columns will lose contact with each other almost immediately. The terrain fragments their force, turning one large army into 3 smaller ones, each attacking independently. And Archidamus, watching from above, can see this unfolding before it even begins. Archidamus positions his forces with surgical precision. He places his strongest unit, the royal guards and veteran warriors, on the western approach, where he expects the main Arcadian assault. These men have survived Leuctra and multiple Theban invasions. They've seen the worst and survived. They'll hold. The Perioikoi take the northern flank against the Argives. It's a calculated risk. The Perioikoi are good troops but not elite. However, the terrain favours defence here. The approach is narrow, rocky, and steep. Even average troops in a good defensive position can bleed an attacker white. The southern approach, where the Messenians are advancing, is held by the smallest force. This seems like a weakness, but Archidamus is betting on psychology. The Messenians are moving to intercept the Celtic mercenaries who are supposedly deserting. When they realise the Celts aren't running but repositioning, they'll be caught in confusion. And confused troops, even motivated ones, die easily. The Spartans form their phalanx 8 ranks deep, the traditional formation. In the front rank stand the proven warriors, men who've killed before and will kill again. The second rank consists of solid, veterans who'll push forward and step into gaps when front rankers fall. Subsequent ranks provide weight, literally pushing the front rank forward in the othismos and serve as replacements. Each man positions himself an arm's length apart, close enough to overlap shields, far enough to wield weapons. The formation is flexible enough to tighten when needed, becoming a wall of bronze or slightly open up for individual combat. It's a formation they've drilled 1,000 times until it's muscle memory, until they can maintain it while exhausted, wounded, and terrified. The shields lock. Not completely, that comes during contact, but enough to create psychological unity. Each warrior can feel his neighbours, can sense their presence even without looking. In the phalanx, you don't fight alone. You're part of an organism, a bronze-plated killing machine that's only as strong as its weakest link. No one wants to be that weak link, and then comes the hardest part of any battle, the waiting. The coalition army is visible now, columns of men streaming through the valley, advancing toward the Spartan positions. But they're still minutes away, minutes that feel like hours, minutes where every warrior is alone with his thoughts, his fears, his mortality. Some men pray silently to personal gods. Others focus on breathing, slow controlled breaths that steady the heart rate and sharpen focus. Veterans check their footing, making sure they won't slip in the coming chaos. First-timers struggle not to vomit from fear, knowing that showing weakness now will haunt them forever. The sound begins to reach them, thousands of feet on rocky ground, the clatter of shields and spears, the distant shouting of enemy commanders. The coalition forces are chanting, working themselves into battle frenzy. It's an attempt to bolster courage and intimidate the enemy. Against most opponents, it works. Against Spartans, it's wasted breath. Archidamus stands at the front of his formation, visible to everyone. He's not pacing. He's not shouting. He's simply standing, spear in hand, shield ready, watching the enemy approach with the calm of a man who's made peace with death. His presence is a lodestone. Warriors look at him and think, if he's calm, we can be calm. If he's ready, we can be ready. The coalition forces are closer now. Close enough to see individual faces, individual shields, individual weapons. Close enough to recognize that these are men just like them. Scared, determined, caught in the machine of war. But that recognition doesn't bring mercy. It brings focus. Those men down there are coming to kill Spartans, to destroy the last army standing between coalition victory and Sparta's extinction. Not today, not ever. The cornered warriors are about to remind Greece why they've been feared for 200 years. The coalition wanted a battle. They're about to get a massacre. And when the dust settles, when the blood stops flowing, when the survivors flee in terror, they'll carry one message back to their cities. Sparta still lives, and Sparta will not die quietly. The Arcadians strike first. Their main column reaches the western approach in the late morning, the sun already climbing high and hot. These are the core forces of the coalition, farmers and townsmen from across Arcadia, fighting on their home soil, motivated by years of Spartan oppression. They number perhaps 4,000, formed into a phalanx 12 ranks deep. It's an impressive sight. Shields overlapping, spears angled forward, the front rank of men moving with grim determination up the rocky slope. They advance slowly, carefully, trying to maintain formation on the treacherous terrain. Loose stones shift underfoot. The incline forces them to lean forward, disrupting the natural balance of the phalanx. Already, before a single spear is thrown, the terrain is working against them. The neat ranks begin to waver. Gaps appear. Men struggle to keep there, shields overlapping while navigating rocks and roots. The Spartans wait. They're positioned about 200 yards up the slope, shields locked, absolutely motionless. Not a word is spoken, not a spear wavers. They look like a bronze statue, a monument to war made flesh. The psychological impact is immediate and profound. The Arcadians, struggling uphill, sweating in their armour, see this wall of crimson and bronze and feel their first tremor of doubt. But they're committed now. Their commanders are shouting encouragement. The men in the rear ranks are pushing forward, creating momentum that can't be stopped. The Arcadian phalanx continues its advance, men gasping for breath in the climbing heat, shields growing heavier with each step. 200 yards becomes 100, then 50. At 30 yards, the Spartans begin their paean. It's not a war cry or a roar. It's a hymn, low and rhythmic, sung in unison by hundreds of voices. The sound is inhuman, otherworldly, like the earth itself is singing. The Arcadians have heard stories about the Spartan paean, how it precedes death like a funeral dirge. Now they understand. It's not meant to inspire fear, it's meant to announce inevitability. At 20 yards, the Spartans advance. Not a charge, a measured, controlled walk forward, maintaining perfect formation. Each step is synchronized. Each shield remains locked with its neighbour. They move like a single organism, a machine of bronze and muscle and disciplined violence. The Arcadians, still struggling uphill, suddenly realise they're not attacking a defensive position. They're walking into a hammer, contact. The sound is like nothing else in human experience. Thousands of pounds of bronze and wood and human flesh colliding at speed. Shields crash against shields. The air explodes with the impact. Men in the front ranks stagger from the collision. Some fall immediately, crushed by the sheer force of the meeting phalanxes. And then the killing begins, hoplite. Combat is not what people imagine. It's not heroic dueling or graceful swordplay. It's industrial-scale butchery conducted at arm's length with bronze-tipped spears. The Spartans excel at this brutal calculus, because they've reduced killing to a science. The front-rank Spartans thrust their spears with mechanical precision. Not wild stabs, but controlled, economical strikes aimed at specific targets: the throat, the face, the armpit where armour doesn't protect, the groin. These aren't random attacks. They're the result of thousands of hours of training, muscle memory so ingrained that thought isn't required. An Arcadian in the front rank raises his shield to block a high thrust. The Spartan instantly adjusts, driving his spear point under the shield rim into the man's thigh. The femoral artery opens, blood sprays. The Arcadian stumbles, his shield dropping. The Spartan's spear is already withdrawing, already thrusting again, this time catching the wounded man in the throat. He goes down. The man behind him steps forward into the gap. The new Arcadian barely has time to set his feet before he's facing 3 spear points. The Spartan directly in front of him feints high. The warriors to either side thrust low and from angles. One spear catches him in the side where his breastplate meets his belt. The bronze point punches through leather and muscle. He screams and falls sideways, disrupting the formation around him. This is happening along the entire front. Dozens of individual combats occurring simultaneously, each one ending in Arcadian blood. The Spartans fight with cold efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary risk. They don't need to be brave, they need to be effective, and they are devastatingly effective. The Arcadians are dying not because they're cowards, but because they're outclassed. They're farmers with basic training facing professional killers. Every move they make, the Spartans have seen before, trained against, developed counters for. The Arcadians thrust their spears with too much commitment, leaving themselves exposed. They raise their shields too high or too low. They take half steps when they should take full ones. Each mistake is immediately exploited. Behind the front rank, the second and third rank Spartans are doing brutal work of their own. Their spears are long enough to reach past their comrades' shoulders. They thrust at Arcadians in the second rank, men who think they're safe behind their front line. A spear appears seemingly from nowhere, punching into a face or neck. Men die without ever seeing who killed them. The terrain continues to work its murderous magic. The Arcadians are fighting uphill, which means they're thrusting up at the Spartans. It's an awkward angle that robs power from their strikes. The Spartans, fighting downhill, can drive their spears downward with gravity's assistance. A downward thrust into the shoulder or collarbone has the weight of the attacker behind it. Bones break. Armour crumples. Men go down and don't get up. The Arcadian phalanx begins to compress. The men in the rear, unable to see what's happening at the front, continue pushing forward. This creates the othismos, the infamous push, where the battle becomes a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare. Shields press against backs. Men are crushed so tightly they can barely breathe. In a conventional battle between equally matched forces, the othismos is where victory is decided through sheer strength and will. But this isn't a conventional battle. The Spartans, with their superior position and training, are using the othismos to create a killing machine. The compressed Arcadian formation means fallen warriors can't get out of the way. They're trampled by their own comrades, crushed underfoot. The wounded lie screaming as hundreds of feet pulverize them into the rocky ground. The smell is overwhelming. Blood and sweat and fear, loosened bowels mixing with the dust and heat into a nauseous cocktail. The Spartans maintain discipline even in the crush. They've trained for this. Practice fighting in compression where you can barely move your arms. They use short, upward thrusts with their spears, economical strikes into groins and bellies and anything exposed. When spears break, and they do break, the ashwood shaft snapping under the pressure, the Spartans switch instantly to their xiphos swords. The xiphos is designed for exactly this situation. It's a short, leaf-bladed sword, about 2 feet long, perfect for close-quarters butchery. You don't swing it, you stab with it. Short, vicious upward thrusts into armpits and throats. The blade is wide enough to cause massive trauma, sharp enough to slide between ribs. Men die gurgling, drowning in their own blood, unable to fall because the press of bodies holds them upright. The Arcadian front rank is being systematically annihilated. Men are falling faster than they can be replaced. The second rank, stepping forward into the front line, finds itself immediately engaged by Spartans who've already killed 3 or 4 men and are still fresh, still controlled, still killing with mechanical efficiency. Panic begins to spread from the front backward through the formation. The men in the rear ranks can't see what's happening, but they can hear it. The screaming, the pleading, the sound of bronze on bone. They can smell the blood. And critically, they can feel the phalanx starting to move backward. Despite all the pushing from behind, despite the weight of thousands of men, the Spartans are driving them back. This shouldn't be possible. The Arcadians outnumber the Spartan force in front of them at least 3 to 1. But numbers don't matter when the front rank is being slaughtered. A phalanx is only as strong as the men actually fighting. Everyone behind the first 3 ranks is just weight. And weight can't stop bronze spear points from finding throats. While the Arcadians are dying on the western approach, the Argives are launching their assault from the north. They've taken a longer route through rougher terrain, and they arrive at the Spartan position disorganized and winded. The Peroikoi holding this flank see them coming and brace themselves. The Argives are better troops than the Arcadians. They have more experience, better equipment, and commanders who understand Spartan tactics. But they've made a critical error. They're attacking across ground so broken that their phalanx formation is barely holding together. What should be a solid wall of shields is more like a series of small groups, each separated by rocks and ravines. The Perioikoi, fighting from prepared positions, exploit every gap. When a cluster of Argives scrambles up to the defensive line, they're met by concentrated spear thrusts from multiple angles. The Argives can't bring their numbers to bear. They're fighting in groups of 10 or 20 against equal numbers of defenders who have elevation and solid footing. One group of Argives finds what looks like an easy approach, a natural ramp of stone leading up to the Perioikoi position. They rush forward, eager to be the first to break through. It's a trap. The ramp funnels them into a narrow front where only 3 men can fight abreast. The Perioikoi have positioned their best fighters at this choke point. The Argives charge into a meat grinder. The first Argive to reach the top takes a spear through his open mouth. The bronze point enters through his teeth and exits the back of his skull. He falls backward, taking the men behind him down. The next wave scrambles over the bodies and meets the same fate. Bronze spear points flashing, men dying before they can even raise their weapons, bodies piling up until the ramp is slick with blood and impossible to climb. Other Argive groups are having similar experiences across the northern approach. Every attempt to rush the Perioikoi position ends in death. The defenders are using the terrain like a weapon, channeling attacks into kill zones, maintaining formation while forcing the Argives to fight in broken, unsupported groups. An Argive commander, seeing the disaster unfolding, tries to pull his men back and reorganize. But retreating from under a spear point is almost impossible. The moment you turn your back, you expose yourself. Several Argives try to disengage and are immediately speared from behind. The others, seeing this, refuse to retreat. They'd rather die facing the enemy than be killed running. The stalemate on the northern flank is costing Argive lives without any gain. They can't break through, but they can't safely withdraw. They're pinned in place, bleeding, and growing more desperate by the minute. This isn't how the battle was supposed to go. They were supposed to be crushing a beaten, desperate Spartan force. Instead, they're the ones being bled dry. The Messenians, advancing from the south to intercept the supposedly deserting Celtic mercenaries, suddenly realize they've been deceived. The Celts aren't running, they're repositioning, and now they're turning to face the Messenians with blood in their eyes and iron in their hands. The Celtic warriors are everything the Greeks are not. They don't fight in formation. They don't maintain rigid discipline. They fight as individuals, each man a storm of violence seeking personal glory. Against a prepared phalanx, this would be suicide. Against the scattered, surprised Messenian force, it's devastation. The Celts charge with their characteristic howl, a sound that's half battle cry, half animal scream. They cover ground with terrifying speed, long legs eating distance, their oval shields held low, their longswords drawn. The Messenians, still trying to form a proper defensive line, aren't ready. The Celtic impact shatters the Messenian formation like a hammer through pottery. Individual Celtic warriors smash into groups of 2 or 3 Messenians, using their height and reach advantage to devastating effect. The long Celtic swords, iron blades as long as a man's arm, slash and hack rather than thrust. A Celtic warrior swings his sword in a wide arc that splits a Messenian shield in half and continues into the man's shoulder. The blow has enough force to cleave through leather, muscle and bone. The Messenian goes down screaming. Another Celt grabs a Messenian shield rim, yanks it aside, and drives a spear into the exposed body. He doesn't wait to see the man fall before moving to the next target. It's not disciplined warfare. It's predators among prey. The Messenians are fighting with desperation born of terror. These aren't the ordered, comprehensible tactics of hoplite warfare. This is chaos made flesh. The Celts are everywhere, moving too fast, hitting too hard. Messenian commanders try to rally their men to form a shield wall to create some kind of defensive position, but the Celts don't give them time. A group of Messenians manages to form a small phalanx, shields locked, spears out. For a moment it looks like they might stabilize. Then 3 Celts charge directly at the formation. Instead of bouncing off the shield wall, they leap at it, physically climbing over shields and spears to get into the formation. It's insane. It's suicidal. It's effective. The Celts drop into the middle of the Messenian phalanx and start killing from the inside. The formation disintegrates into individual combat, and individual combat is where the Celts excel. The Messenian attack has not just stalled, it's been reversed. Instead of cutting off Spartan retreat routes, they're fighting for survival against an enemy they don't understand and can't counter. Men are starting to break, to run, to abandon the battle entirely. And once that starts, it spreads like plague. On the western approach, the Arcadian phalanx breaks. It's not a dramatic moment. There's no trumpet blast or dramatic last stand. Men in the front rank simply start backing up faster than they're being pushed forward. Gaps appear in the shield wall, and once gaps appear, the Spartans exploit them with ruthless efficiency. A Spartan warrior sees an Arcadian stumble, his shield dropping. The Spartan doesn't hesitate. His spear drives forward into the man's neck. As the Arcadian falls, the gap widens. 2 more Spartans step into the breach, their spears finding targets on either side. The gap becomes a wound in the phalanx. The wound spreads. Men in the Arcadian rear ranks, unable to see what's happening but feeling the formation crumbling, make the rational decision. They run. Once the rear rank breaks, the pressure holding the formation together evaporates. The middle ranks, suddenly without support, feel themselves being pushed backward by nothing but Spartan pressure. They turn and run too. The front rank Arcadians, still fighting, suddenly find themselves unsupported. They look back and see their army fleeing. In that moment of distraction, Spartan spears find them. The last organised resistance collapses. The Arcadian force becomes a mob of terrified individuals, each man trying to save himself. This is where hoplite battles traditionally become bloodbaths. A routed phalanx is helpless. Warriors throw away their shields to run faster. They discard spears that impede their flight. They're running in armour that weighs them down, desperate to escape, unable to defend themselves. And the pursuers, organised and disciplined, cut them down like wheat. The Spartans don't pursue immediately. Archidamus maintains discipline even in victory. The phalanx holds its position while skirmishers and light troops are sent forward to harry the retreating Arcadians. This prevents the main Spartan force from being drawn out of position and potentially ambushed. It's strategic brilliance, accepting a smaller slaughter now to avoid risk later. But the skirmishers and the Celts have no such restraint. They tear into the fleeing Arcadians with savage joy. Celts catch, running men from behind, their longswords severing spines and splitting skulls. Light-armed troops throw javelins into the mass of fleeing bodies. Every thrown spear finds a target. There are too many targets to miss. Men die running, speared from behind, falling face first into the rocky ground. Others are caught and cut down in small groups, pleading for mercy that doesn't come. Some try to surrender, throwing down weapons and kneeling. They're killed anyway. This isn't personal cruelty, it's practical. The Spartans can't spare guards for prisoners, and leaving armed enemies alive in your rear is suicide. The collapse of the Arcadian attack triggers a chain reaction. The Argives, still locked in their grinding stalemate with the Perioikoi, see the Arcadian rout and feel their confidence evaporate. They're supposed to be part of a three-pronged assault, overwhelming the Spartans through coordinated pressure. Instead, they're alone, bleeding, making no progress, and now they can see Spartan forces wheeling from the western approach toward their position. Panic spreads faster than any runner could carry news. Men in the Argive rear ranks start backing away. Commanders scream at them to hold, but the fear is contagious. The Perioikoi, sensing weakness, begin to advance. It's a slow, controlled movement, but it shifts the psychological balance completely. Defenders don't advance, victors advance. The Argives try to make an organised withdrawal, and to their credit, some units manage it. They back away while maintaining formation, shields locked, spears out. But maintaining formation while moving backward through broken terrain is nearly impossible. Men trip. Formations break. And when formations break, the Perioikoi are on them like wolves. The organised withdrawal becomes a rout. Men run, they die running. The northern approach, which was supposed to collapse the Spartan flank, becomes a killing ground. Bodies pile up at choke points where fleeing Argives are caught by pursuing Perioikoi. The lucky ones die quickly. The unlucky ones are wounded and left to bleed out on the rocks, their screams echoing through the hills. In the south, the Messenians aren't even fighting anymore. They're in full flight, scattered across the countryside, pursued by howling Celts who've found glory in slaughter. The Messenian force, which was supposed to cut off Spartan retreat, has been annihilated as a fighting force. Individual warriors are still alive, still running, but as an army they've ceased to exist. As the last organised enemy resistance crumbles, as the pursuit spreads across the Arcadian hills, Archidamus orders the roll call. The commanders move through the Spartan ranks, calling names, checking faces. The process takes time. Men are covered in blood, enemy blood, and dust and sweat. But one by one, every name receives an answer. Not a single Spartan citizen has fallen. Not one. The Perioikoi have taken casualties, a handful of dead, more, wounded. The losses are real but minimal. The Spartan phalanx, the core of the army, is intact. Every man who stood in formation when the battle began is still standing when it ends. The reasons are tactical and can be analysed. The terrain favoured defence. The Spartans fought from prepared positions. Their superior training and discipline allowed them to kill efficiently while minimising exposure. The enemy attacked in uncoordinated waves, allowing the Spartans to defeat them in detail. All of this is true and can be explained, but it still feels impossible. Battles don't work this way. Even overwhelming victories cost lives. The front rank always pays the blood price, except today. Today, every tactical advantage, every strategic choice, every year of training aligned perfectly to create something unprecedented. A massacre where only one side died. The battlefield tells the story. Bodies are scattered across hundreds of yards of rocky hillside. Most are concentrated near the western approach where the Arcadian phalanx met its end. The dead lie in their formations, still recognisable as military units even in death. They died where they fought, killed so quickly they couldn't even run. Individual bodies tell smaller stories. An Arcadian warrior with 3 spear wounds in his chest, each one fatal. a Messenian caught from behind, his skull split by a Celtic sword, an Argive with a spear through his back killed while trying to retreat. Each corpse is a lesson in the brutal efficiency of professional violence applied against amateur courage. The wounded are harder to count. Hundreds, certainly, maybe more than 1,000. They lie scattered across the battlefield, calling for water, for help, for their mothers. Some will be collected by their surviving comrades if any return. Most will die slowly as the sun sets and the night cold settles over the Arcadian hills. War doesn't stop being cruel just because one side wins perfectly. The Spartans move among the dead, collecting their own equipment, stripping enemy corpses of anything valuable. This isn't disrespect, it's practicality. Armour costs money, weapons are expensive. A warrior's gear is valuable whether he's alive or dead. The Celts are less systematic, taking trophies, heads mostly, which they'll preserve and display as proof of their prowess. As the afternoon wears on, messengers are dispatched to Sparta. They'll run through the night carrying news that seems too good to be true. The army that marched out facing extinction has won not just a victory, but a perfect victory. The coalition that threatened Sparta's existence has been shattered, and impossibly, miraculously, no Spartans died. The sun begins to set over Mount Parasia, painting the blood-soaked hillside in crimson and gold. The Spartans stand in formation, silent as statues, as Archidamus surveys what they have accomplished. The wounded lion has reminded Greece of its claws. The supposedly broken Spartan war machine has proven it can still kill with peerless efficiency. And Sparta, bleeding, desperate, cornered, has just announced to the world that it's not done yet. Not by a long way. The Spartan army doesn't linger in Arcadia. Archidamus knows that staying would invite counterattack once the coalition forces regroup and receive reinforcements from Thebes. Victory, no matter how complete, doesn't mean safety. The wounded lion has proven it can still kill, but it's still wounded. The smart move is to withdraw before the larger predators arrive. The march back begins at dawn the day after the battle. The Spartans move in tight formation, fully armed, expecting ambush at every turn. They're carrying captured weapons and armour stripped from enemy dead. A fortune in bronze and iron that will help replenish Sparta's depleted arsenals. The Celts, loaded down with trophies and plunder, are in high spirits, singing their incomprehensible songs and occasionally breaking into spontaneous mock battles with each other. The route takes them through territory they ravaged on the march north. The burned farms, the destroyed villages, the signs of systematic devastation. It's a grim reminder that war isn't just about glorious battles. It's about destruction, suffering, and the slow grinding down of civilian populations caught between armies. The Spartans pass refugees huddled in the ruins of their homes, staring at the warriors with hollow eyes. There's no triumph in those stares, just exhaustion and hatred. But as they cross back into Laconia, into Spartan territory, the mood shifts. Word of the victory has already spread. How? Nobody's quite sure, but news travels faster than armies in the ancient world. Small groups of Spartans line the road watching the army pass. They don't cheer. Spartans don't cheer. But you can see it in their faces. Relief, pride, and something that might be hope. For 3 years, every time a Spartan army marched out, it came back defeated or diminished. Leuctra was a catastrophe. The subsequent Theban invasions were humiliations. The raids into Laconia itself were intolerable insults. The Spartan people have been living with defeat, with the knowledge that their military supremacy was broken, that the mystique that protected them for 2 centuries was shattered, and now, finally, a victory. Not just a victory, a perfect victory. The official messengers reach Sparta a full day before the army. They run through the night, carrying news so extraordinary that they almost don't believe it themselves. They arrive at dawn, exhausted, covered in dust, and are immediately brought before the ephors, the 5 elected officials who effectively run Sparta's government. The lead messenger delivers his report in the clipped, efficient Spartan manner. The army engaged a coalition force near Belea. The enemy was routed. Thousands of enemy casualties. Spartan casualties, none. The ephors look at each other. One of them asks the messenger to repeat the casualty figures. The messenger does. 10,000 enemy dead, 0 Spartan dead, not even one. There's a moment of silence. The ephors are not men given to displays of emotion. Spartan political culture prizes self-control above almost everything, but they're human. One of them closes his eyes. Another's hand trembles slightly. A third asks if the messenger is certain, absolutely certain, that no Spartans fell. The messenger confirms. He was present for the roll call. Every name answered, every warrior accounted for. The ephors dismiss the messenger and convene privately. They need to decide how to announce this news to the city. Sparta in 368 BC is a community in crisis. The defeat at Leuctra killed 400 citizens from a total citizen body that had already shrunk to perhaps 1,500. 3 years of invasions, raids, and defeats have devastated morale. The city that once struck fear across Greece has been reduced to defending its own borders, watching helplessly as former subjects build new cities and form new alliances specifically to contain Spartan power. The loss of Messenia was particularly catastrophic. The Helots, enslaved populations who worked Spartan farms, had been freed by the Thebans and formed their own independent state. This cut Sparta's agricultural base in half. Spartan citizens, who were prohibited from engaging in any economic activity other than warfare, suddenly faced food shortages. The entire social system that allowed Sparta to maintain a professional military class was collapsing. In this context, the news from Belea is more than a military victory. It's proof that Sparta can still function, can still win, can still be Sparta. The ephors understand the psychological importance of this moment. They also understand that how they present this news will shape how Spartans remember and interpret it. They need to balance honest reporting with the need to rebuild confidence and morale. The announcement is made in the agora, the public square, at midday when the maximum number of citizens can be present. One of the ephors steps forward to address the crowd. He's an older man, a veteran of the wars before Leuctra, someone who remembers when Sparta was unquestioned master of the Peloponnese. His voice is steady as he delivers the news. The army of Archidamus engaged enemy forces in Arcadia. Coalition troops numbering in the thousands. The enemy was defeated. Thousands of enemy dead. And then the crucial detail: no Spartans killed in action. The ephor pauses after delivering this information, letting it sink in. For a moment, the crowd is silent. They're processing what they've heard, checking it against what they know about warfare, about casualties, about the brutal arithmetic that usually governs battles. Then someone, nobody remembers who, makes a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. A release of tension that's been building for 3 years. And then someone else makes a similar sound. And then another. The Spartan crowd, famous for their stoic self-control, for their ability to face death and disaster without visible emotion, begins to weep. Men and women alike, tears streaming down weathered faces. They're not crying from sadness. They're crying from relief, from joy, from the overwhelming realization that Sparta isn't finished. The city that seemed destined for destruction has just pulled off the impossible. This is why history will call it the Tearless Battle, not because no Spartans died, but because the survivors came home to a city weeping with joy. The Greek term adakriton carries both meanings: a battle without tears of mourning because no one died, and a battle that caused tears of joy because everyone survived. The dual meaning is perfect, capturing both the military miracle and the emotional release it triggered. The weeping doesn't last long. Spartans quickly reassert their legendary self-control, wiping away tears, composing their faces into the mask of indifference they present to the world. But for a few minutes the mask slipped. The human beings beneath the Spartan warriors showed themselves. And in that moment of vulnerability, the city found something it had lost at Leuctra: hope. When Archidamus and his army enter Sparta 2 days later, they receive a reception that's subdued by any standard except Spartan ones. The citizens line the streets, watching silently as the warriors march through in formation. There are no cheers, no flower petals thrown, no celebrations. But there's something in the air, a shift in atmosphere, a change in the collective mood that's palpable even without overt displays. The warriors march to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, the primary religious centre of Sparta, where sacrifices of thanksgiving will be made. The army forms up in the temple precinct, and the priests perform the rituals. Animals are slaughtered, prayers are offered, the gods are thanked for their favour. It's all very formal, very controlled, very Spartan. But watch the faces of the men who march to Belea. Watch the younger warriors, those who expected to die in Arcadia and are still processing their survival. Watch the veterans who remember when victories like this were routine and are savouring the reminder of former glory. Watch Archidamus himself, standing at the front, his face impassive, but his eyes betraying the weight he's been carrying. After the formal ceremonies, the army is dismissed. The warriors disperse to their homes, to their families, to their private lives. And here, away from public view, the real celebrations happen. Wives embrace husbands they feared were dead. Children cling to fathers who marched away with uncertain prospects. Parents thank gods they don't entirely believe in for the return of sons. One story, probably apocryphal but capturing the spirit of the moment, tells of a Spartan mother who greets her returning son with the words, "The gods smiled on you." He responds, "The gods smiled on Sparta." She corrects him, "Then may they continue to do so." It's a very Spartan exchange, no excessive emotion, no flowery language, just an acknowledgement of divine favour and a hope it continues. But beneath the austere words is profound relief. In the days following the victory, Archidamus meets with the Ephors and the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, to discuss the strategic situation. The Tearless Battle was a triumph, but it doesn't change the fundamental reality. Sparta is still surrounded by enemies, still outnumbered, still facing an existential threat. The question becomes, what does this victory actually accomplish? The optimists argue that it restores Sparta's military reputation. For 3 years, enemies have been emboldened by the defeat at Leuctra, assuming Sparta was finished. The Tearless Battle proves that assumption wrong. It demonstrates that Spartan warriors, properly led and fighting on favourable terrain, are still the most effective heavy infantry in Greece. This should make enemies more cautious, more hesitant to challenge Sparta directly. The pessimists counter that a single tactical victory doesn't alter the strategic balance. The Arcadian League still exists. Messenia is still independent. Thebes is still the dominant power in Greece. Sparta is still isolated, still demographically weak, still facing long-term decline. The Tearless Battle might boost morale, but morale doesn't feed cities or produce more citizen soldiers. The underlying problems remain unsolved. Archidamus, ever the pragmatist, sides with the pessimists. He knows what he accomplished at Belea. He destroyed one coalition army and bought Sparta breathing room. But he didn't change the war. The Arcadians will rebuild their forces, the coalition will continue to exist, and Thebes, when it finishes its current campaigns elsewhere, will return to the Peloponnese with armies Sparta cannot hope to match in open battle. The discussion turns to strategy. Some argue for an aggressive follow-up, march back into Arcadia, press the advantage, try to knock the Arcadian League out of the war permanently. Others argue for defence, use the victory to negotiate from strength, try to peel off coalition members through diplomacy, focus on rebuilding Sparta's depleted citizen body. Archidamus advocates for a middle path, exploit the victory for diplomatic gains where possible, launch limited offensives to keep enemies off balance. but avoid major battles unless the terrain and circumstances heavily favour Sparta. The Tearless Battle worked because everything aligned perfectly. Terrain, timing, enemy mistakes, Spartan discipline. Trying to replicate that success by seeking battle against unfavourable odds would be suicide. The council accepts his reasoning. Orders go out to maintain a defensive posture while conducting limited raids into enemy territory. The goal is to remind enemies that Sparta can still hurt them while avoiding the kind of set-piece battles that could lead to another Leuctra. It's an unglamorous strategy, far from the days when Sparta could march where it pleased and impose its will through force. But it's realistic, and realism, not glory, is what's keeping Sparta alive. Meanwhile, in Arcadia, the coalition is reeling. The survivors of Baelia straggle back to their cities in ones and twos, bringing news of the catastrophe. The numbers vary in the telling. Some say 10,000 dead, others say fewer, still others say more. But everyone agrees on the basic facts. The Spartan army was vastly outnumbered, was supposedly trapped, and somehow managed to slaughter the coalition force without significant losses. The Arcadian leadership tries to spin the defeat. They emphasize that the coalition wasn't destroyed, just one army. They point out that Sparta didn't pursue the victory, didn't try to capitalize on it, which suggests they're still weak. They argue that the defeat, while painful, doesn't change the fundamental strategic situation. All of this is true. None of it helps morale. The psychological impact of the Tearless Battle ripples through the coalition. Warriors who survived Baelia spread stories about Spartan invincibility, about divine omens, about enemies who fight like machines and kill without mercy. These stories are exaggerated in the telling, becoming more mythic with each retelling. But myths have power. Myths shape how men approach battle, how much courage they can muster when facing death. The next time an Arcadian army faces Spartans in battle, every man will remember Baelia. They'll remember the thousands dead. They'll remember the stories of perfect discipline and ruthless efficiency. And in the crucial moment when phalanxes collide and men must choose between holding their ground or breaking, that memory might be the difference between victory and rout. The Tearless Battle didn't just kill coalition warriors, it planted seeds of doubt in every survivor's mind. The Argives, who lost heavily at Baelia, become more cautious in their military planning. They're not cowards. Argive warriors have fought Sparta for centuries and will continue to do so. But they're more selective about when and where they engage. They avoid battles where terrain favours the Spartans. They seek numerical superiority before committing to combat. They've learned that wounded lions are still dangerous, and they adjust their tactics accordingly. The Messenians, newest members of the coalition and most emotionally invested in Sparta's destruction, are the most affected. They wanted desperately to prove themselves against their former masters, to demonstrate that free Messenians could defeat Spartan warriors in open battle. Instead, they were scattered by Celtic mercenaries and Spartan discipline. The psychological blow is severe. Some Messenian leaders argue for renewed aggression. They need to wipe away the stain of Baelia with a victory. Others counsel, caution, attacking Sparta again too soon might lead to another disaster. In the years and centuries that follow, historians and military theorists will debate the Tearless Battle. Was it a masterpiece of tactical planning, or was Archidamus simply lucky that everything went right? The debate is important because it speaks to larger questions about warfare, leadership, and the role of chance in human affairs. The case for tactical genius is strong. Archidamus chose terrain that negated enemy numerical superiority. He positioned his forces to fight defensively from elevated ground. He used the Celtic mercenaries as bait to divide enemy forces. He maintained discipline even in victory, preventing his troops from pursuing too aggressively and potentially being ambushed. Every decision he made was correct, and collectively those decisions created the conditions for a perfect victory. Moreover, Archidamus understood psychology. He knew the coalition troops were not professionals, that they could be broken if hit hard enough at the right moment. He knew his own troops needed a victory to restore confidence. He knew that fighting defensively would maximize Spartan advantages in discipline and training, while minimizing the risk of casualties. This wasn't just tactical competence, this was strategic vision. But the case for luck is also compelling. The coalition made mistakes that Archidamus couldn't have predicted. The Messenians took the bait of the Celtic withdrawal, dividing their forces at a crucial moment. The Arcadians and Argives attacked in uncoordinated waves rather than mounting a simultaneous assault. The terrain, while favourable to defence, could have worked differently if enemies had been more patient. And the divine omen, the thunder from the right, was pure chance, not something Archidamus could control. Most importantly, the zero casualty figure is almost certainly luck. Even in a perfectly executed battle, front-rank warriors face enormous danger. A spear thrust that's blocked by a shield but slips under and catches someone in the leg. That's luck, not tactics. A warrior who stumbles at the wrong moment and takes a fatal wound. That's chance, not planning. Archidamus created the conditions for low casualties, but zero casualties required everything to go right in thousands of individual combats. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between genius and luck. Archidamus was brilliant. His tactical decisions were sound. His understanding of terrain, psychology, and his own troops' capabilities was masterful. He created the conditions for victory, but he also got lucky. The enemy made mistakes. The omens happened at the right moment. And most crucially, in hundreds of individual combats where Spartans faced death, the spear thrusts missed, the shield blocks worked, the footing held. Skill kept casualties low, luck kept them at zero. The immediate impact of the Tearless Battle is clear. Morale boost for Sparta, shock for the coalition, breathing room in an existential war. But what about the long-term impact? Did this perfect victory change anything fundamental about Sparta's trajectory? The answer is mostly no. Within a few years, the Arcadians complete construction of Megalopolis, the fortified supercity designed specifically to contain Spartan power. The coalition continues to function, continuing to pressure Sparta militarily and diplomatically. Thebes remains the dominant power in Greece until the rise of Macedon in the next generation, and Sparta's citizen body continues its demographic decline, the fundamental problem that no tactical victory can solve. Archidamus himself will become king in 359 BC and will spend his reign trying to stabilize Sparta's position through careful diplomacy and limited military campaigns. He avoids major battles, having learned from Belea that victories, even perfect ones, don't necessarily change strategic realities. He'll eventually die fighting in Italy in 338 BC, leading an expedition to help the Greek city of Tarentum against local Italian tribes. He'll die in battle, spear in hand, embodying the Spartan ideal of a warrior's death. But here's what the Tearless Battle did accomplish. It gave Sparta time. Time to adjust to the new reality of being a second-tier power. Time to develop new strategies for survival in a world where Theban and later Macedonian power dominated Greece. Time for the psychological wounds of Leuctra to begin healing. In a sense, the Tearless Battle was Sparta's graduation from the hope of restored hegemony to the reality of managed decline. It also gave Sparta something intangible but valuable, a final moment of glory. The Spartan warrior tradition, the mystique of invincibility, the reputation built over 2 centuries, all of it was dying after Leuctra. The Tearless Battle was a last flash of the old Sparta, a reminder of what the system could produce when everything worked perfectly. Future generations of Spartans would look back on Belea as proof that their ancestors' reputation wasn't entirely mythical, that there really was something special about Spartan military culture. For Archidamus personally, the Tearless Battle secured his legacy. He could have been remembered as the prince who presided over Sparta's decline, the heir who couldn't stop the bleeding after Leuctra. Instead, He's remembered as the commander who pulled off the impossible, who defeated an enemy army without losing a single man. It's the kind of achievement that makes you legendary, that gets your name passed down through history alongside the greatest Spartan commanders. And for the warriors who fought at Balea, they carried the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. They'd faced an existential moment and won perfectly. They'd proven to themselves and the world that Spartan training, Spartan discipline, and Spartan courage still meant something. Many of them would die in later battles. Sparta's wars didn't end in 368 BC, but when they died knowing they'd been part of something extraordinary. They'd fought in the Tearless Battle, they'd experienced the impossible. That memory didn't change Sparta's strategic situation. It didn't restore Messenia or defeat Thebes or solve the demographic crisis, but it gave them something to hold on to in the dark years ahead. And sometimes, in the twilight of civilizations, that's enough. The Tearless Battle stands as one of the strangest victories in military history precisely because it seems too perfect. Modern military analysts looking at the engagement struggle to explain the zero casualty figure. Even in battles with overwhelming advantages, technological superiority, perfect intelligence, ideal terrain, casualties happen. Friendly fire occurs, men stumble and are killed by opportunistic enemies. Random spear thrusts find gaps in armour. War is chaos, and chaos produces casualties regardless of tactical brilliance. Yet, at Balea in 368 BC, chaos somehow produced order. Every Spartan who entered battle emerged alive. The Perioikoi took losses, yes, but the core Spartan force, the red-cloaked warriors who formed the spine of the army, suffered 0 deaths. It's the kind of result that makes historians suspicious, wondering if the ancient sources exaggerated, if the story grew in the telling until it became mythology rather than history. But the sources are consistent. Xenophon, the Greek historian and military theorist who documented much of 4th century Greek warfare, doesn't question the casualty figures. Neither do later historians who had access to records now lost. The Tearless Battle appears to have happened essentially as described, a perfect tactical victory where one side was annihilated and the other emerged unscathed. This creates a paradox. If such victories are possible, why are they so rare? Why doesn't every well-commanded, well-trained army achieve similar results? The answer reveals something fundamental about warfare. Perfect victories require not just skill, but an alignment of factors that's almost impossible to replicate. Terrain, timing, enemy mistakes, weather, morale, training, leadership. All of these must align perfectly. At Balea, they did. But trying to recreate those conditions intentionally is like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. Archidamus understood this instinctively. After the Tearless Battle, he didn't seek another major engagement. He didn't try to replicate his perfect victory. He knew he'd gotten lucky in the broader sense. Not that the victory was unearned, but that the conditions allowing such a victory were unlikely to recur. Instead, he shifted to a strategy of limited engagements, defensive warfare, and diplomatic manoeuvring. He'd achieved the impossible once. Trying for twice would be suicide. What can modern military thinkers learn from the Tearless Battle? The lessons are surprisingly relevant despite the 24 centuries separating us from the event. First and most obviously, terrain matters. Archidamus chose his battlefield carefully, positioning his forces where natural features multiplied his advantages and minimized enemy strengths. Modern militaries still prioritize terrain analysis, still seek to fight from positions that favor their capabilities. The principle scales across all forms of warfare. In urban combat, defenders choose buildings that offer clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. In naval warfare, commanders seek weather and sea conditions that favour their vessel's capabilities. In air combat, pilots manoeuvre to gain altitude and positioning advantages. The specific terrain changes, but the principle remains. Force the enemy to fight where you're strongest and they're weakest. Second lesson. quality beats quantity when quality is properly applied, the Spartans were outnumbered but better trained, more disciplined, and more experienced. In a conventional battle on flat ground, numbers might have overwhelmed them, but in terrain that prevented the coalition from bringing their full strength to bear, Spartan quality dominated. Modern special forces operate on the same principle. Small numbers of highly trained operators can achieve objectives that would require vastly larger conventional forces. Third lesson: morale is a weapon. The Spartans at Belea were fighting for survival, for redemption after Leuctra, for their civilization's continued existence. The coalition troops were fighting for revenge and political goals, but lacked the same existential motivation. When the battle turned against them, when the front rank started dying in disproportionate numbers, their morale broke quickly. The Spartans, conversely, would have fought to the last man rather than break. That psychological difference translated into tactical advantage. Fourth lesson: discipline under pressure is what separates professionals from amateurs. The coalition forces, despite numerical superiority, couldn't maintain formation on difficult terrain while under attack. They broke into smaller groups, lost cohesion, and were defeated in detail. The Spartans maintained formation throughout, adjusted to changing circumstances without losing structure, and executed their tactical plan with precision. All the training in the world means nothing if soldiers can't apply it under the stress of actual combat. Fifth lesson: never underestimate a cornered enemy. The coalition made the fatal mistake of assuming that a weakened, defeated, surrounded Sparta would be easy prey. They failed to consider that desperation can be a force multiplier, that an enemy with nothing to lose fights with the ferocity that comfortable, confident forces can't match. Modern militaries still fall into this trap, assuming that technologically superior forces will easily overwhelm desperate defenders, only to find that desperation breeds creativity and resistance. The Tearless Battle also illuminates what made Spartan warfare unique in the ancient world. Most Greek city-states fielded citizen militias, men who trained occasionally, fought when necessary, but spent most of their time on economic pursuits. Sparta was different. Spartan citizens were professional warriors from age 7 to death. They didn't farm, didn't engage in trade, didn't have conventional careers. They trained for war, and when not training, they fought wars. This created a class of warriors with skill levels that part-time soldiers couldn't match. A Spartan warrior had been training with spear and shield since childhood. By the time he entered battle as an adult, he'd spent thousands of hours drilling formations, practicing spear thrusts, learning to kill with mechanical efficiency. His muscle memory was so ingrained that he could maintain formation while exhausted, wounded, and terrified. He could thrust his spear with killing precision while standing in compression so tight he could barely breathe. Compare this to an Arcadian farmer who trains a few weeks per year and has maybe fought in 1 or 2 small skirmishes. When these forces collide, the outcome is predictable. The Arcadian makes mistakes, holds his shield wrong, thrusts his spear with poor technique, loses footing on rough terrain. The Spartan exploits every mistake instantly. The combat effectiveness gap is enormous, but this system had a fatal flaw. It was demographically unsustainable. To maintain a class of full-time warriors, you need a large slave population to handle economic production. Sparta's helot system provided this, but it required constant military force to maintain. When Leuctra broke Spartan military power, the helots revolted. When the helots were freed, Sparta's economic base collapsed. The professional warrior class couldn't be maintained without the slave economy supporting it. So the very system that made Sparta's warriors so effective was the system that ultimately destroyed Sparta as a major power. The Tearless Battle showcased the peak effectiveness of the Spartan system, but it couldn't save that system from its inherent contradictions. You can win every tactical engagement and still lose the strategic war if your fundamental model is unsustainable. Understanding the Tearless Battle requires understanding Leuctra. the defeat in 371 BC wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered Sparta's self-image and revealed the fragility underlying their reputation for invincibility. For 2 centuries, Sparta had dominated Greek warfare through a combination of genuine military excellence and psychological intimidation. Enemies often broke before battle even began. Convinced they couldn't defeat the legendary Spartans, Leuctra proved they could be defeated. Epaminondas showed that innovative tactics could break the Spartan phalanx. 400 Spartans died that day, a catastrophic loss from a citizen body that numbered perhaps 1,500. And critically, the myth died. Sparta could bleed. Sparta could lose. Once that knowledge spread, enemies who'd previously been too intimidated to challenge Spartan power found courage. The 3 years between Leuctra and the Tearless Battle were a nightmare for Sparta. Theban invasions, Helot revolts, the loss of Messenia, former allies abandoning them, every week brought fresh humiliation. The psychological weight on the remaining Spartan warriors must have been crushing. They'd been raised to believe they were invincible, that Spartan training and discipline made them superior to all other warriors, and then they'd watch that invincibility shatter. The Tearless Battle was Sparta's response to Leuctra. It was proof that the old Sparta still existed somewhere beneath the defeats and humiliation. Yes, Thebes could win a major battle through innovative tactics and numerical advantage, but Spartans, properly led and fighting on favourable terms, could still achieve the impossible. They could still make enemies pay in blood. They could still win so perfectly that the victory itself seemed like mythology. For the warriors who fought at Belea, the Tearless Battle was personal redemption. They'd lived with the shame of Leuctra, with the whispers that Sparta was finished, that the next generation would read about Sparta in history books the way they read about Troy or Mycenae, great powers that had fallen into dust. The perfect victory at Belea proved otherwise. They were still Spartans. The system still worked. The training still mattered. They could still kill with peerless efficiency. But Archidamus, watching his warriors celebrate, understood the deeper truth. One perfect victory couldn't undo 3 years of strategic catastrophe. Sparta's problems were systemic, demographic, economic. The Tearless Battle bought time and restored morale. It didn't restore Messenia or rebuild the citizen body or solve any of the fundamental issues destroying Spartan power. It was a beautiful moment, a flash of the old glory. But it was also a sunset, not a sunrise. Here's something the ancient sources don't emphasize but modern analysis reveals. The Tearless Battle, for all its tactical brilliance, was strategically limited. Yes, Archidamus killed thousands of enemies without losing a single Spartan, but he didn't follow up. He didn't pursue the broken coalition armies and destroy them completely. He didn't march on Megalopolis and try to prevent its construction. He won perfectly and then withdrew to Spartan territory. Why? Because he understood something crucial. Even perfect tactical victories have costs. His army was exhausted from forced marches and battle. His Celtic mercenaries were ready to go home. His supply lines were extended deep into enemy territory. And most importantly, Thebes, the real threat to Sparta, wasn't at Belea. The coalition forces he'd destroyed were secondary enemies. The primary threat was still intact, still dangerous, still capable of crushing Sparta if Archidamus overextended. This is the paradox of perfect victories. They're seductive. They make commanders think they can keep winning, that the factors that aligned once will align again. But warfare doesn't work that way. The coalition learned from Belea. They didn't offer Archidamus another battle on his terms. They focused on defensive fortifications, on building Megalopolis into an unassailable stronghold, on avoiding the kind of engagement where Spartan discipline could dominate. Archidamus accepted this reality. Lesser commanders might have sought another glorious victory, might have marched their armies into disadvantageous battles seeking to replicate Belea's success. Archidamus knew better. He'd achieved the impossible once through a combination of skill and fortune. Trying for twice would be gambling with Sparta's last field army. If he lost, Sparta died. So he didn't try. He accepted that the Tearless Battle was a singular achievement, not a repeatable formula. This might be the most important lesson from Belleia, knowing when to stop. In warfare, in business, in life, there's a temptation to push success further, to believe that momentum is infinite. But every victory has limits. Every success carries within it the seeds of overconfidence. The wise leader recognizes this and stops while ahead. The foolish leader pushes further and discovers that fortune is finite. Archidamus was wise. He won perfectly, withdrew safely, and spent the rest of his career fighting defensive wars that preserved Sparta rather than seeking offensive victories that might destroy it. He never achieved another tearless battle. He didn't try, and that restraint, that wisdom to accept limits, might have been his greatest strategic achievement. The Tearless Battle marks a moment in military history, the last flash of Spartan supremacy, the final proof that the old system could still produce impossible results. After 368 BC, Sparta continues to exist, continues to field armies, continues to fight. But they never again dominate Greek warfare. The era of Spartan hegemony is over. The future belongs to Thebes, then Macedon, then Rome. Sparta becomes a curiosity, a living museum of an earlier age. When Philip II of Macedon conquers Greece in the 330s BC, he leaves Sparta independent, not out of respect, but because they're no longer worth the effort of conquest. By the time Rome dominates the Mediterranean, Sparta is a tourist attraction, a place where wealthy Romans go to watch reenactments of ancient Spartan training methods. The warrior culture that once terrified Greece becomes a theme park. The demographic decline proves insurmountable. Sparta never rebuilds its citizen body to pre-Leuctra levels. The birth rate among Spartan citizens continues falling. Land ownership concentrates in fewer hands. The economic system can't support the warrior class. All the tactical brilliance in the world can't solve structural problems. Sparta dies not from military defeat, but from internal contradictions the system couldn't resolve. Yet the memory persists. 2,000 years later, military academies still study Spartan tactics. The story of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae is known worldwide. The Spartan warrior ethos, discipline, courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, continues to inspire, and the Tearless Battle, that impossible perfect victory, remains the ultimate example of what's possible when training, leadership, terrain, and fortune align perfectly. Archidamus himself embodies this transition. He's the bridge between old Sparta and new reality. He grew up in the era of Spartan dominance, fought in battles where Sparta was assumed to win, but he spent his career managing decline, fighting defensive wars, trying to preserve what could be preserved. He dies in Italy in 338 BC, killed fighting alongside the Greek city of Tarentum against local Italian tribes. It's a fitting end. Spartan warrior dying with spear in hand, far from home, fighting for allies who need his expertise, the last representative of a dying breed. Why does the Tearless Battle matter? Not for its strategic impact, minimal, not for its long-term consequences, basically none. We remember it because it represents something fundamental about human capability under pressure. A small group of highly trained, highly motivated warriors, properly led and fighting on favourable terms, achieved something that seemed impossible. They defeated an enemy force many times their size without suffering a single death. That achievement speaks to possibilities. It suggests that in the right circumstances, with the right preparation, extraordinary outcomes are possible. Not likely, not guaranteed, but possible. And that possibility inspires. Every military force that's ever faced long odds and won has drawn inspiration from battles like Belleia. The specific tactics may be outdated. Nobody fights in phalanx formation anymore, but the principles remain eternal. We also remember it because of what it cost. Not in lives, no Spartans died, but in the psychological price paid by warriors who knew this might be their last moment of glory. They fought with the desperation of men defending everything they value. They won perfectly because they couldn't afford to lose at all. That kind of existential motivation produces extraordinary performances, but it also reveals how close they were to annihilation. The Tearless Battle is a sunset victory, a last perfect moment before darkness. Every warrior at Belea knew Sparta was dying. They'd seen the demographic charts, understood the economics, recognised that the old system couldn't survive in the changing world. But for one afternoon in the Arcadian hills, they proved that the old Sparta, the legendary invincible Sparta, still existed. They could still fight with peerless skill. They could still win against impossible odds. They could still be Spartans. And then they marched home to a city that was dying anyway. The victory didn't save Sparta. It didn't restore Messenia. It didn't rebuild the citizen body. It didn't solve any of the fundamental problems, but it gave them something more valuable than victory: dignity. They went down fighting, and they went down proving they were still who they'd always claimed to be. In the long twilight of civilizations, sometimes that's enough. Modern military forces still study the Tearless Battle, though not necessarily by name. The principles it demonstrates show up in staff colleges and tactical manuals worldwide. Choose terrain that favours your strengths. Maintain discipline under pressure. Exploit enemy mistakes ruthlessly. Fight from prepared positions when possible. Accept favourable engagements and avoid unfavourable ones. These lessons are timeless because they're based on human nature and physical reality, neither of which have changed in 24 centuries. Special operations. Forces in particular find inspiration in the Tearless Battle model. Small numbers of elite troops, properly trained and led, conducting operations against numerically superior but less skilled opponents. The specific weapons and tactics differ, but the conceptual framework is identical. And occasionally, modern special operations achieve results that seem impossible. Perfect missions where objectives are accomplished without friendly casualties, and military analysts recognise the echo of Belea in those successes. The battle also appears in discussions of morale and motivation. How do you motivate troops to perform at their absolute peak when the odds are terrible? The Spartan answer: make them understand they're fighting for survival, give them training that builds absolute confidence, provide leadership they trust, and then put them in positions where their training advantages matter. Modern militaries don't replicate the Spartan system. It was brutal, exploitative, and ultimately unsustainable. But they study what worked about it and adapt those elements to modern contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the Tearless Battle reminds military leaders that perfect victories are outliers, not templates. Planning for best-case scenarios is foolish. Expecting to replicate extraordinary success is dangerous. Archidamus won perfectly once and never tried to replicate it. Modern commanders would do well to learn that lesson. Extraordinary success should be celebrated but not expected, enjoyed but not chased. The pursuit of perfect victories often leads to catastrophic defeats. The Tearless Battle remains one of the most extraordinary victories in military history. A perfect tactical execution that produced impossible results. 10,000 enemies dead, not a single Spartan killed. It's the kind of achievement that makes you question the boundaries of what's possible when skill, courage, and strategic brilliance align perfectly. If you're fascinated by battles where everything seemed impossible until someone did it anyway, this channel is your home. We dive deep into the blood-soaked reality of ancient warfare, the tactical genius and brutal sacrifice that shaped civilizations. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Check out our playlist on ancient battles that changed history. Link in the description. Comment below. What other impossible victories do you want us to cover? What battles deserve the deep dive treatment? Your suggestions shape what we create next. And if you made it this far, you're serious about military history. share this video with someone who appreciates the brutal truth of ancient warfare. Let's build a community of people who understand that history isn't mythology. It's blood, sweat, terrain, and the thin line between genius and catastrophe. The Tearless Battle proves that on one impossible afternoon in 368 BC, that line favoured Sparta. The wounded lion roared one last time, and Greece remembered why they'd feared that roar for 200 years. Until the next battle, stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, history is written by survivors, but it's made by warriors willing to face impossible odds. Now go watch our video on the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal surrounded and annihilated a Roman army twice his size. If you thought the Tearless Battle was impossible, wait until you see what happened when tactical genius met Roman arrogance.